welcome to everybody, and I'm sorry we're so tightly packed, but I'm also gratified that we have so many people to show up for this. So my name is John Huth, and I am a Radcliffe Ventures faculty member, so that means that I help put together programs at Radcliffe. My main focus is on the sciences, and this year we had a science symposium in October on oceans, and then have a series of themed lectures associated with oceans, and this is the last in the series. This is close to my last official act as a Radcliffe Ventures faculty, and I will just note that Alyssa Goodman over here will be taking my role, so you'll see her at the podium in future Radcliffe events. So, on to the main event. So, a lot of cultures use waves in some way as a navigational aid on the oceans. This is fairly well known, but as far as I'm aware, the use of waves in navigation really reached its pinnacle in the Marshall Islands. And it fascinates people, it fascinated me. When you look at some of the artifacts that are used to teach people, you're wondering, what is that, and what does that mean, and so on. And so the fascination is understandable, and trying to tease apart what the Marshallese navigators did, how they were taught, and how they conceptualized using waves on the open ocean really requires an interdisciplinary approach. And I was introduced to this and started collaborating with one of the first of our speakers, Joe Genz, who is an anthropologist at the University of Hawaii. And he introduced me to Alson Kelen, who runs an outfit called Canoes of the Marshall Islands, and spent quite a bit of time understanding the traditions of canoe building, and he'll talk about his enterprise with that. And he acted as our host and navigator on a voyage that we took. And Gerbrant von Vledder, who is from the University of Delft, and he specializes in the numerical simulations of waves. So we all assembled together in the Marshall Islands in Majuro, in the capital, talked to one of the last surviving indigenous navigators who unfortunately passed away in January. And then we took this trip from Majuro to a neighboring atoll, Hour, and back again, and documented as best we could to try to understand the traditions. And Monday and Tuesday we held a workshop to go over our findings, because it took a while to crunch the numbers and to think about it. And so now we met yesterday and today, talked about what we saw. Some new information came out as we started talking to each other. We're going to write a paper, and we have some ideas about a forthcoming journey that we're going to make, where we're going to try to systematize some of our findings. Okay, so thank you for being here, and I turn it over to Joe.
Thanks. Okay. All right, hello everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Joe Genz, and as John said, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, and I've been connected to this project since about 2001, when I first started as a graduate student. So what I'm going to try to do today is just back up a little bit and talk about some of the context that started the development of this project, that will then lead into what Alson and Gerbrant and John will talk about. So the first thing to note is that we're talking about wave piloting, right? But this is really a system of navigation, and in particular, this is practiced and has been practiced historically in a few places in the Pacific Islands, what the residents of that group in the world refers to as Oceania. And anthropologists have been particularly drawn to this system of voyaging, which really encompasses a whole range of things, from canoe building to sailing to astronomy to weather forecasting, and then the kind of ultimate domain of knowledge of navigation. The image that I'm showing up here today is a picture from our canoe voyage in 2015. And the other image from the Bishop Museum in Honolulu from 1883, to me, represents a very strong continuity of knowledge in this particular case. And so anthropologists have looked at canoe voyaging in a lot of different ways. Among them is looking at how the canoes and the systems of navigation could have allowed for the two-way intentional settlement of the Pacific, the discovery, the exploration, and the intentional colonization of those islands That's been a large focus of what anthropology has looked at. But in order to understand that, to think about that prehistoric past, anthropologists have also needed to know a lot about the knowledge systems themselves. And so if we look back in time, these voyaging traditions that span the breadth of Oceania, some of them declined very dramatically several hundreds of years ago. So in places like Hawaii, they basically had to reinvent and kind of relearn their system of navigating that basically died out about 200 years ago. On another kind of spectrum of voyaging, in places like Sarawak, which is in the contemporary nation state of the Federated States of Micronesia, they practice voyaging on a daily basis. It is part of the fabric of their lives. And somewhere in the middle between those two in this spectrum of voyaging is the Marshall Islands, where there are traditions that are intact to some degree, but there's also been a very large decline. So this is a map of the Marshall Islands. It's a very large region. It encompasses 29 coral atolls and 5 low-lying coral islands that spread an area of about 750,000 square miles. So it's a very large area. When we look at language distributions, historical observations, archaeological evidence, it's very clear that the Marshallese had very strong voyaging capabilities, as evidenced by this historic map that was produced by a German explorer named Kotzebue, who was part of a Russian expedition who worked with navigators to produce this map based on their geographical knowledge. And another way that we know this is through the historically documented stick charts. These were largely collected and sent to museums around the world, largely in Europe in the late 1800s. This was one in a museum in Berlin. And some of what this shows is you can make out some of the different names of the atolls in the Marshall Islands, all the way from Ebon in the south up to Bikini in the north, which is where Alson is from. So some of these stick charts map out wave patterns in relation to the islands, sometimes current formations. But those dark lines that are labeled as ogar, those are representing wave patterns that would actually be kind of like a sailing path between different island pairs. And so some of this does represent like large interaction spheres between different island groups. However, historically, the Marshallese have faced some of the most intense moments of colonialism ever. In about 100 years, they went through regimes by the Spanish, then the Germans, then the Japanese, and then the Americans. So there were a lot of social changes that happened from this. Missionization came in, totally fundamentally altering religious belief systems, which impacted voyaging. Under the German colonial administration, prior to World War I, they put bans on voyaging where it was illegal to actually sail on canoes. And then right after World War II, the US started a 12-year program of nuclear testing from 1946 to 1958 as part of their nuclear weapons testing era. And as this relates to what we're talking about today, the site where a lot of these tests took place is the atoll of Bikini. And this is one of the images from that time period. And I don't have an image up here of a different test. It was codenamed Bravo. It was the world's first weapons-grade thermonuclear detonation. And that took place on March 1st, 1954. The fallout from that landed on a neighboring atoll named Bikini. Rongelap, thank you. And there was a whole series of tests that went into place, such as biomedical experimentation without consent. And what this meant was that the people of Rongelap experienced a lot of direct radiation exposure, and they've been since, there's very complicated history here, but they're essentially off of their atoll living as refugees, in a sense of nuclear exodus, because they can't live there anymore. Related to our story is on Rongelap, this was a traditional navigational school that possibly, if that testing hadn't happened, there would have been probably about 10 youth in the 1940s and 50s that would have kept learning here in a traditional style of how to navigate by the waves. One of those young people was a young boy named Corinth Joel, who later became known as Captain Corinth. And because of this testing, he never had the chance to really fully become a navigator, although he had a lot of navigational knowledge that he had learned. So, fast forwarding, by the time the 1990s rolls around, he is getting a lot older. there was finally some appropriate ways in the Marshalls for him to start to share some of his knowledge. He was beginning to have the permission from his chiefs that were governing him about how to talk about the navigational knowledge that he knew. But ultimately, he was not a navigator. He had not taken a test that would have allowed him to be sanctioned as a navigator. And so he knew a lot about the waves, but not all of the system. So he actually had this call, kind of an invitation for a team of essentially anthropologists and scientists to come in to both help him fulfill his breadth of knowledge to understand some of the wave dynamics, but also to validate and verify some of the ideas behind his wave theories. And so essentially he catapulted this program as an invitation for myself initially to come in to work with Alson, which he'll talk about right now, and that ultimately his dream was to have a physicist and an oceanographer come and help him understand the theories underlying how these waves were forming that he was trying to use. And I'd just like to mention this now, that he passed away in January of this year. So it's a pretty sad time for the Marshallese, but his direct person that he was teaching is sitting right here. So Alson Kelen has been his apprentice that's been learning under him. And I just wanted to highlight as well that what we're talking about, it is very time sensitive. So we were also working with some elders from Rongelap. These were people that were slightly older than the navigator, Captain Corin Joel. This was his uncle, Ijao Eknilong, his aunt, Leet John Eknilong, and another relative, Willie Mwekado. Leet John and Willie have since passed away. Only Ijao survives. So there still is this pocket of traditional knowledge, but it's just barely hanging in there. And so what we're trying to do today is not only learn about these waves from a physical oceanographic perspective, but we're also trying to feed into Alson to allow him the way, to facilitate the ways that he can perpetuate this knowledge. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Alson.
I was really starting to enjoy Joe's talk when he finished. Well, before I do my 2 minutes presentation, I'm going to do a little chant. And this is a navigational chant that I try to teach. Well, I teach at the school, and not just the chant, but the definition of it and the meaning of it, so the kids would feel the cultural pride and the self-esteem. Anyway, Jine kwaret togiamotok ngai kamo ngai kamu ngai Jine ha kurup kanem kanene wilik enene wilik yoin kubakanam repichat lemenam paparang lotenam kallo kopanam walil wechoro li pelalua charom chadal chago. Usually you say this 3 times to get that spirit going. Now that spirit is gone. So 25 years ago, I actually lived in Oregon before, and 25 years ago I went back to the Marshalls. As Joe mentioned, I originated from the Bikini Atoll. I actually lived there for 4 years before we got relocated because this is the nuclear. It was too radiated for us to live there. So we moved to Majuro, and then I went to high school in Hawaii. So I lived in Oregon for a while. And 25 years ago, I went back, and I worked for the National Museum and the Marshalls. I was very excited because, one of the things that when I grew up in Bikini, one of the things we had a sailing canoe. And my father used to take me out a lot, and he would tell me all these stories about them voyaging between Bikini, Rongelap, and Huth. So that was, it was like already embedded in me. We didn't have TV, so in the evening my father would open his arm and I was lay flat on the arm and close my eyes, and that was my TV. He would tell me the story. And the word for Marshallese would say, "Pitak pain pupu im chuma." That's literally mean use your arms as your pillow. because when you use your arm as a pillow, you learn. You talk and you learn. And it's funny because, the canoe that we use for our voyaging studies is called Chidram Kabel, which means forehead to forehead, you share the knowledge, the skills. So when you lay your arm, you head on the arm, you actually exchange that. So 25 years ago, I was involved in a documentation project, and our job was to go from atoll to atolls to document the step-by-step construction of canoes. And our last project I was working with a colleague of mine from San Diego. It's a server boy named Dennis Alicio. All he knew was building wooden boats and go surfing. So him and me, we kind of connect pretty well, because all I knew at the time was fishing. So we were on Ujai documenting the canoeing culture. Most of the time you go into town, so that was kind of good for me because I could actually directly learn my culture. And but while we were doing all that work anywhere, all over the Marshalls, especially me, see a lot of the young people coming to the program, coming to the site, and I was very happy because my thinking was, yes, they are very into learning their culture. I learned later that these young people actually, a lot of them are dropouts. A lot of them do not pass the high school exam. And in the outer island, the Marshalls, if you do not pass the high school exam at the age of 14, that's pretty much it. You get to start thinking about making a living out of making oil or, and starting a family. So my colleague and I says, you know what, when we get to Majuro, we're going to start at school. We have to start a school of some sort. So when we went back to Majuro and we finished our project with the National Museum, both of us were jobless. So we sat down and said, well, what do we know about starting a school? Pretty much zero. What kind of skills do we have? Nothing. The only skill we have is the skill that we learned traditionally, the skill that was passed to us from the masters. But I like to note that, in the Marshalls, the skills actually passed on from generation to generation to the family. So you have to be adopted in order to learn the skills. And when we were on Ujai studying this, documenting, a lot of the master builders, they were doing all the measurement behind their back, even though it was the permission. So you have to go to the chief to get the permission. So even though you get the permission from the chief, you still, they were still hesitant because it have to be from family to family. So so we decided that we're going to use the knowledge, to document the knowledge, to train the young people. But unfortunately, we didn't have the money to do it. So I'm just going to quickly just go a little bit outside of my talk and talk about this little funny story. So we had this voyaging canoe we built on Ujai. And so when this project was done, so we sailed this canoe from Ujaya to Kwajalein, which is about 130 miles, and then from Ujaya to Kwajalein, which is about 250 miles. So I was the caretaker of this canoe, and I started to bring in the young people, the young guys, so we can go out sailing and fixing. And of course, we didn't have any money. I was volunteering. So one day, an Australian ambassador came in, and he asked me if I could take him out sailing. I said, sure. So I took him out sailing, and he said, well, I really enjoy this. Can you tell me your dream about this? So I told him my dream. I want to start a school using the documented knowledge to teach the young people that, are the dropouts. And I tell him this story, and then when we finish, he says, yeah, write me a proposal. Never done that before in my life. So he came back 3 days, and he says, where's my proposal? I said, well, I put the dates, and I'm still deciding, is it dear with me concern or dear sir? He said, you know what? Here's $10,000. You start the program, and I will write the proposal for you. At that time, I had a good friend, Dr. Andrew Kinyuki, was working for land grant at the college in the Marshalls. We always talk about canoes. And every time after we talk about canoes, it says, you bring me $100, I will double it. 200, I will double it. I said, what do you mean double? I'll give you 200, 400. I ran to his office, I knock on the door, and he opened and says, what's going on? I pull out the check. It says, $10,000. He says, okay, what am I supposed to do with it? I said, well, remember, 100, 200, 200, 400. He said, yeah, but, there's procedures. You have to write me a proposal. I said, what is this about proposal? The Australian wrote a proposal for me. How come the American cannot write a proposal for me? And that money started the canoe program. We started call around and call Hawaii, Big Islands, to get woods to start up our A-frame building to start up the canoe program, but because we were just doing it on the beach. So you can see there that we've been bringing young people. The first picture, you saw the canoe. We teach them the cultural part. We use canoe as the medium, but we also, now we just have this addition to the project is the carving part of it. But we found out that is what we need also to do is to have counselors on life skills if we want to really work with the dropouts to complete the picture of training. And not only the training part is important, but you need to do something fun. So they make learning fun. And actually, the cultural pride. So we start canoe races. So I went to all the mayors from different atolls. I said, well, bring the best of the best, and we will to the Top Gun, the best of the best in Majuro. And of course, nobody want to lose a race, so they brought all the best of the best, and so we started doing canoe races. And the canoe knowledge, the canoe tradition in the Marshalls has been expanded tremendously. A lot of the people, because of the canoe races, because of the schools, people are building canoes, building canoes in the out islands. And of course, fuel is so expensive. You cannot, for communities that make $1 a day, the fuel cost is $9 to $10 a gallon. It's unreasonable. So sustainable sea transport, canoeing culture, it's there. So it's not just the canoeing that we're kind of teaching, but now that we're getting involved more and more with the team, I'm the only person here that have no PhD, or they don't call me doctor. So I'm so happy to have the group with me so they can, I just talk and to do all the numbers and all that stuff for me. So this is one of our stick chart. And this stick chart here is, Joe mentioned the name Esau. He was actually supposed to be here, but he was not feeling very good. So anyhow, this is his stick chart to explain the swells. And of course, this is Joe's explanation of the stick chart. And you can see this Pungdogyung. Pungdogyung is the swells that come from north. And Pungdo is this stick, this swell that comes from east. And Pungdogrut, it comes from south. And Kailabata is the swells that comes from west. And Marshallese believe that these wells you use to show the direction where you're going. And of course, here is the Nubian cut, and Churanogome is part of this. It's a mixture of these two. And Cajun rhythm. This one is the Ludoglakan. But the word Ludoglakan is pouring outside. So I think more detail will come as we, the other presentations. So thank you very much.
Can I start the animation? Sorry, I didn't write anything down. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and there's also a story behind my presence here. I'm from Holland, and in the Netherlands we need to protect our country against the anger of the sea. So we are used to know the wave environment on the North Sea, and we built our water defenses for that. So my professional career is always in the development and application of wave models to predict for safety reasons. But 4 years ago I was reading a book about navigation, and there was one book chapter about wave navigation. And then I thought, that's interesting. I didn't know that application. So during my research, I came into contact with Joe, and then we had a lot of email correspondence. And then 3 years ago, Joe asked me in January, I'm going to the Marshall Islands for an expedition. Do you want to join? What do you say? No? No, of course, yes. So that's how I became involved in this project. And the very interesting part is that wave navigation is there for ages, many hundreds of years. And in the last few hundred years, there were people trying to document it and describe it. And that was also my interest. So as was introduced by John, the last navigators there wanted the science becoming involved. So my research started by looking at the waves in the whole Pacific and how they affect the Marshallese Islands. So what you can see here is the whole Pacific and an animation of, this is the winds, and the whole Pacific is often called the quiet ocean, but that only relates to the equatorial region. But in the south you can see the roaring 40s, all the big winds, near Antarctica, and in the north also near Alaska. Those winds are generating all kinds of waves. And these waves, they radiate over the whole of the Pacific and then enter the Marshall Islands. So we can here see a snapshot of the waves that are still actively driven by the wind. And the next is, those are the waves that escape the wind fields, and they are called the swell waves. And the swell waves, we know, are waves that are moving gently over the ocean. And these swell waves can propagate tens of thousands of kilometers from the very south to the very north, and halfway they pass the area of the Marshall Islands. So the Marshall Islands are affected by local waves generated by the trade winds, and also by the waves coming from Antarctica, from the south and from the north, and as Alson told, waves coming from all kinds of directions. And because of that, the Marshall Islands have the unique feature that there are all kinds of interesting and stable wave systems passing by. And because they last for a number of days, you can rely on them for navigation purposes. So this is an animation of the southern part of the ocean. This is one feature. This is a period of the waves of all the swell fields crossing each other. And as you can imagine, just sit down on one point and you will see different wave systems coming from the south, from the west and the north at the same time. And this is really the information that was picked up by the navigators to help in their steering over the ocean. So the next step is we can look in more detail what happens over the course of a year. So this is a plot. Let's just concentrate on the upper part. On the horizontal axis, you see each day in a particular year. On the vertical axis, you see the direction from which a certain wave field is coming. And what you can see bands of waves. In the north, near 360, you see all the dots. They represent the swell coming from the north, and it's almost always present. And there's also a southerly swell, almost present all of the year. And at 90 degrees, that is the trade winds, waves generated from the east, and they are also persistently existent. So this persistency makes it feasible that the people there can navigate reliably between all the oceans. If you then go one level deeper, the waves come to the islands and they interact with the islands. So what you can see there is a schematic diagram of the green island. The waves come from the east, they bounce against the island, they have reflections, and people can pick up the reflected wave from the island. On the other hand, behind the island, the waves bend around it and they create cross patterns. And now the remarkable feature is that the navigators can look at the sea surface, feel it, and then know where they are with respect to the island. So that was all schematic, and now we wanted to bring in the science in more detail. So we applied some computer modeling, and we just looked in detail what happens with all the swell waves and how they interact with the wave, with the island. So you can see some shallow water effects around the island. The waves bend around the island, and at some point you can see a bit of a reflection in the island. So this is a very nice tool, and we just started playing with this tool to unravel all the intricacies of what all the people know there for ages. But now we want to bring it in more detail and help them understanding why all the wave phenomena happen. So this is just another example, and here you can see a bigger island, and the reflection of the waves is more easily visible. Well, 2 years ago, we were there in the ocean, and we did traveling from the island. The red line is the course of the canoe. The eastern course is going up. We went to the island of Hour, and a few days later, we went down again. And we used, again, the computer modeling to reconstruct what are the wave conditions. And John took all kinds of measurements of the waves and the winds, and we put them together, and luckily they agreed a bit. But this is a level that we also can see the shadowing effect of the islands. So if a navigator goes from one island to another island, it can see all kinds of features and differences in the ocean environment. And that is really the trick, reading the environment and reading the wave patterns, and then know where you are, almost. So, and the next step is, now we want to the navigator is standing on the canoe and he feels the wave motion. So what we are now trying to do is we just make a reconstruction of the wave surface. The red dot represents a canoe going through the sea, and the lower two panels show the vertical movement, the heave, how the canoe goes up and down. And the lower panel, the black line, is the pitch as the canoe goes this direction, and the red line is the roll this direction. So this is the first step in our analysis. What do the navigators feel? So the next challenge is really to put instruments on the canoe and then really measure what are the motions of the canoe. And that will help us understanding the whole way of wave piloting. So from the big ocean scale to the scale with the island and the scale of the sea, of the ship. So this is really a challenge, and we have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thanks. So, what is my toolkit? I don't know. My toolkit's that of a physicist, so it's not clear. I'll pick up where Gerbrant left off, and the navigators will tell you, the indigenous navigators will tell you that it is the sense of the motion that they have. Sometimes they'll lie on their back on the canoe, close their eyes and feel it. We were talking with Alson today about it and about how he felt the waves, and he said he actually felt more comfortable navigating at night than he does during the day, because he said that his eyes played tricks on him. And so there's this notion, you don't look at the waves, you actually feel them. And to some extent, what I did was not only to try to help document the voyage, but I also try to put my feet in the shoes of an apprentice navigator, sort of knowing what I learned and how well can I do from what I've been taught. And so it's like baby's first steps in wave piloting is the best way I could put it. So it was a lot to juggle at that point. I think Ijao, who we talked to, said that you feel it in your stomach. And in fact, there's this one mysterious notion that we're still trying to unravel, and I'll share with you what I think it might be. There are these paths that connect pairs of atolls in the Marshall Islands called a drillib. And it's been described as a disturbed path of water that connects pairs of atolls. And it's not a reflection or a refraction as Gerbrant described. That's something different. There are words for that too. But this drillib is this mysterious path of disturbed water that connects pairs of atolls. And I'd been scratching my head as to what exactly this represents, because the descriptions I was given didn't really seem physically correct to me. But this is a bit where the art of trying to understand the culture and the physical descriptions is difficult. And one of the things that is true, at least for me, and other examples are, if I were to ask you, how do you know to get from here to there? You would just say, well, I know it. I mean, there is this intuitive kind of sense of how you get from one place to the other that you develop, and it's sometimes difficult to then turn around to somebody who hasn't done it and then explain it to them. So we're dealing with maybe the difficulty of communicating something that's intuitive knowledge, or maybe it's the language that is being used to describe it. But so the idea is, can we feel it? And so that was at least one of the things that I was hoping to come away from this voyage with, in addition to documenting it. So here's another view of part of the Marshall Islands. The capital is Majuro. We all flew in there, except Alson was there, and spent a fair amount of time getting used to things. And then we departed Majuro with Alson and his crew on the Jadam Kapil, which is the outrigger, sailed north to Aur, and I'll describe the voyage, visited the island of Tabal in the atoll of Aur, and then had a return voyage back. And so my job was to try to document it, but I also wanted to understand how their systems might operate. So here is a little video clip of the Jadam Kapil in the lagoon of Aur, and you can see the outrigger, which is bouncing up and down a bit, is designed to do that. It has to flex, and that's one of the amazing aspects of the engineering of these Marshallese canoes, is that you cannot rigidly attach this outrigger. It has to be designed to have a kind of give and take to it, and so it's remarkable if you see these things up front. The other thing is the outrigger balances against the wind, so the canoe might just heel over at an angle, and so what the outrigger does is it counterbalances that, and it also helps keep it tracked straight. So I don't know how many of you are sailors, if you've ever heard the term leeway, but under the influence of the wind, you can actually get pushed sideways. And so the design of these things are remarkable. They almost have no leeway whatsoever, so they track very straight and go exactly where you want to go. Okay, so the outgoing voyage, which I think you can see here. Yeah, so I hope you can see that. Here's the track of the outgoing voyage here. Can you all see that? Yes. Okay. So what I had a GPS with me, so part of it was to just figure out, where are we? Each of the places we go. We left this cut close to sunset. This is the way I tried to indicate visually on the map the swells. So the swell direction, the motion of the winds, the waves and the swells were in the direction of the arrow, and the crests were perpendicular to that. So it just helps the visualization, my way of visualizing the waves. So there is this set of waves. When we first left the cut of Majuro, the waves were coming directly at us, so from the north. But as we left Majuro towards sunset, the waves were then coming at an angle, and eventually from the west. And In the middle of the night, I swear I felt some motion of a swell from the north. What Alson did, and he'll tell you later, was he was concerned that we were going to actually run right into the reef of Our in the middle of the night, because a very strong wind kicked up as we were sailing, and so he made the decision to sail somewhat to the east of Our, and then he estimated that the sunrise would happen when we were to the east, and then we would sail into Our. It was a very rough night, and we got splashed in the chase boat. I think all of us, like at least I got incredibly seasick on the way out, and it was a really bumpy ride. And when we got out there, there was a maneuver to turn towards Our that Alson wanted to do, but it proved to be difficult, especially because the rope holding the mast broke. So we used the chase vessel to tow us in. So that was interesting. We then arrived in Tabal, which is in the north of Our. So you see here some of the crew taking supplies in. So we took supplies here. You see Alson with, I guess, effectively the mayor of Our. Is that who that is? Yeah. Yeah. And so here you see some of the supplies there. And we had an amazing feast. I mean, I've never been greeted by a group of strangers so kindly. It was just unbelievable. And we spent a few days and had a return journey. So I didn't know exactly what to expect and how to document this thing. So we were exposed to the ocean. So this was my toolkit. I had a GPS with me. I had a handheld weather station, which had an anemometer to measure wind speed. And I had a compass to get the heading. And so using these three things and documenting it, I could figure out where the wind was blowing. I could use my body to figure out where the waves were going just by feeling the motion of the canoe. I was able to figure out what the current was doing, because I could calculate from the heading and the way the sails were pointed in the canoe where they should be going, but then when they were going in a slightly different direction, I attributed that to current. So just using some native smarts, an Excel spreadsheet, and the stuff that I pulled together, I was able to reproduce a lot of the course, especially on the way back, because it was a little bit calmer. So here you see my notebook. And just a bunch of scribbles. It looked like a bunch of scribbles, but I was able to reconstruct the voyage. So here is the return trip, at least an indication of the return trip. So we went through the cut in Our, I guess a few hours before sunset. And it was interesting. I was curious about what this path one could follow from one atoll to another would be. And what I found was that the trade wind swell always seemed to be coming perpendicular to our path, moving perpendicular to our path, and our path was actually an arc of some kind. And so that was a clue that perhaps, if you follow this arc, that you would find your way to Majuro. Also, in the middle of the night, what I did was I lay on the back in the canoe and just tried to feel the motion. So it went kind of side to side, rolling 3 times, 1, 2, 3, and then I had one up and down. So I figured there was a trade wind, and this happened over and over again. So there was like a trade wind swell that was rolling me back and forth, and then there was some swell from the north that was pitching me up and down. So, and I wrote this in my notebook, so I was like, okay, this is it. I'm staking myself to this observation, and it better work out. Okay, just to show you that the observations, at least of the this path that I thought we were following was correct. Here is the hindcast that Gerbrant got by just looking at the winds from the Pacific, the North Pacific, and the trade winds and so on. And indeed, I basically nailed the correct observations of where the trade wind waves and swells were going. So I kind of got that right from the observations. One of the things that was a little scary was that it looked like we were getting blown off course to the west, which Alson was also concerned about, indicating there was some sort of a current. So Alson felt a current of some kind. This is just an intermediate plot that I used. This is showing, instead of the direction of the swells, this is showing the wind speed that I got from the anemometer and figuring out the true wind direction. And so you could see we had wind speeds kind of approaching 10 knots, but they died down around sunrise, but then they picked up again. And using that, knowing which way, this is just a diagram, which I'm not going to walk you through, but this dotted line indicates the performance characteristics of a proto-Hakalea vessel, which is the one that the Polynesian Voyaging Society uses and just did a round-the-world trip with. And here's the Jidam Kapil, which is much more performant. So it's like a Ferrari compared to you know, a minivan or something, I guess, for lack of a better term. So using that and the information I had, I was able to figure out the currents, and the currents were quite strong near Aur and Majuro, and this was what was sweeping us to the west, and this is also what Alson was highly concerned about. In any case, he'll talk maybe a little bit more about this. We also had the data, the wave data from this period, and this is a weird plot, but let me just sketch out what it is. So the angle around this dot is the direction that the swells are moving in, the waves are moving in. So this bit here are the trade wind waves that are coming from the east and they're moving toward the west. So you see this big blob here, and then the radial axis is frequency. So the longer the period, the closer you'll be to the center. Okay, so a very long period swell would be close to the center. So if I just let this evolve here, and this is actually, it was, you know, basically 2 years to the day, to today when we did this. And so when I got this plot, I looked at it and said, okay, well, there's the trade wind swell, and look at that. There's a swell from the north, and it's there, and I was like, yeah. So I was able to, you know, get the swell, get the directions, and also feel this north swell, you know, my first time out. And I was just like overjoyed when I saw this. So, okay, maybe I'm overplaying it for you folks, but that was my baby's first book of wave piloting. Okay, so I'm just going to turn it over to Alson for his impressions of the trip out. So you can just talk about it now. You can just riff on it.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to get to talk about these kind of stuff after they explain all the details. So the trip out was very interesting. First of all, we forgot the pot to cook our meal, to cook the rice. Of course, in the Pacific, rice is a pretty big thing. So we used a teapot. So okay, we're gonna cook the rice, take all the rice out, and cook the hot water. So that was a pretty good way to start out the sail. And it was, you know, when we went out, it was still daytime. So I was kind of looking at the swells, hoping to find the strong eastern swell that would show me where to go. And as we go further out from Majuro, then you can kind of feel it. And of course, like John was saying, because I keep repeating that I am always afraid to sail during the day because there's so many type of waves and currents. And as a student, you know, I rather eliminate a lot of those things and just feel my way out. So as we go out, there was a lot of swells, you know, rains, wind, and every time there's a swell come in, we would face the canoe right into the wind. And at that time, you know, we were going backward. And having all that taking place, you know, we trying to estimate where we would be if we don't, trying to estimate where we would be. So, and keep in mind that from previous voyages, I kind of know what time I would hit Aur. It'd be kind of dangerous to go directly there, so we were going as far east as possible to get there. And then the plan was because the wind comes like this, we'd go to out that direction and then just kind of have a nice easy sail down. But unfortunately, when we look up at the mast, the rope that holds the sail up was halfway, almost. It was pretty dangerous, so we brought it down and we got towed in. On the way back, it was a very nice sail. As soon as we got out, we could see that there was a current pushing toward east. But the problem is the wind kind of died out, so we were pushed out more than we wanted. So when the wind started to pick up in the morning, we tried to come as close east as possible. So, because these two islands, I know that the farther you come east, I think the more advantages if I were to come east. So, but the wind was coming. I mean, the currents were pushing us west. So there's another island toward south. So I keep going up. Keep saying, oh, I hope we won't go to Jalwood, which is far. But fortunately, the wind picked up during the morning hours, and we were able to come directly into the pass, which was a good feeling because instead of going anywhere else, we actually come in toward the pass. So it was a pretty good feeling. It was a success, I think. So where do we go from here? We visit schools and talk about canoe programs and talk about our culture. And from what we've learned from this trip, personally, I want to continue. I want to make sure that what we have gathered so far would be something to look at and to move forward and trying to figure out ways to make sure that we complete our work. Joe mentioned that he came in and started talking, Ben Finney and Joe talking to Captain Korn. And one of the goals that Captain Korn has, because he was a navigator, he wants to have one side is traditional navigation and the scientific. So, because even me, when people ask me about certain swells, I can talk about the swells, but the details of it and scientific detail of it, I don't know. So I think it would make the study even 100% better if we put those two fields together. The canoe there is actually in Hawaii. It's called Okeano Marshall Islands. It was donated to the Marshall Islands as part of this sustainable sea transport. Of course, you probably know that Marshall Islands is a low-lying island. It's most affected by climate change. So one of the big things that our government is doing is going out and talk about climate change. And this is one, of course, again, Joe explained about these islands and 750,000 square miles. So we're so small and big at the same time. And which means that our islands are so small, but yes, we use probably more fuel than any other, some other countries around the world. And for a country that talk about climate change, I think we need to change our attitude toward transportation and any other means of fossil usage. So we got this canoe, and I think that's the plan now, is to try to see if we can utilize it. And of course, this canoe has been going to be under the auspices of University of the South Pacific. So it's even better because it's an educational institute. So I think that's the goal now, is to rethink and replan the future of this program, and of course to utilize our canoe program and the youth that I'm working with. So let's see what else.
We're good.
That's good.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, so I guess what we'll probably do now is just take some questions and have some discussion. So there's a microphone, and I'll let, I guess somebody else can adjudicate the questions or something, and we'll try to take them. And if you're going to address us, you might want to tell us who you're asking Yep, okay.
Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting. I guess I would address it to you as the physicist.
Yes.
What determines the periodicity of swells?
Okay.
Is it the dynamic strength of the wind? Is it the distance it travels? And would they be then differentiable, north, south,
Yeah,
west?
that's a wonderful question. So, what determines the height and the period of the swells is what's called fetch, which is the duration and the time over which the wind has been blowing. So the longer the fetch, typically the longer the period, especially the stronger the wind, the longer the period. So if there's a hurricane out in the Atlantic, you can get swells that have periods of maybe 22 seconds or something like that, and they travel at 50, 60 miles an hour. So the sign of a hurricane with the swells can well outrun the hurricane itself, and it's thought that maybe Columbus was able to determine there was a hurricane in his fourth voyage by looking at these swells. So they do have a different character. The swells from the Southern Ocean have very long periods associated with them. I mean, Gerbrant could say more, but I'm sort of thinking 14 to 22 seconds. The North Pacific swells can also be somewhat as long, but I sometimes in my gut I feel them a little bit shorter period than the Southern Ocean swells. And the trade wind swells tend to be more wind-driven and steeper face, so you tend to get swells that have periods of like 7 to 11 seconds. So each one has kind of a fingerprint associated with it. That's kind of the short answer.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree, yeah.
So, John, you mentioned the Hokulea,
Yeah.
which has been very much in the news recently
Yes.
because it just re-entered Honolulu Harbor after
Yes.
a 3-year circumnavigation.
Yes.
So the last few days, and that's a double-hulled outrigger canoe, is that right?
It's a double-hulled canoe, yes. A catamaran
Double-hulled.
style, yeah.
So the last few days, I've been wondering about among these different atolls, these different Pacific atolls, traditionally, what is the overlap in, for example, boat building technique, in navigational technique, and in maybe the theory behind the navigational technique, and what are the differences between the Marshall Islands and the Hawaiian Islands, et cetera?
Well, should I take a whack at it? Okay. Yeah. Well, so as Joe said, the navigation and canoe building pretty much disappeared in the Hawaiian Islands, with the exception of these small outriggers that were used more for races than anything. So the idea of the double-hulled canoe was developed by at least combination of, I guess, Ben Finney, Joe's thesis advisor, and an artist named Herb Kane, who drew a lot of paintings of what he imagined the Hawaiians, when they were doing long-distance voyaging, used. And the large catamaran double hull makes a lot of sense for really long-distance voyaging, like the 2,000-mile run from Tahiti to Hawaii, because for the smaller canoes, like the Jadam Kapil with the smaller outrigger, they really get a workout, and the lashings get a really heavy workout. So the Hokulea was designed to withstand a lot of beating, like over a month of ocean swells. But there's not a lot of extant information about that structure, although I guess there was a recent archaeological find in the South Pacific of a very large steering board. So that sort of backs that idea up. The navigation schema, again, was lost in the Hawaiian Islands. So the way the Polynesian Voyaging Society approached this was that they actually went to Sarawal, which is a Micronesian outlier, and Alson will be very quick to say that this navigator, Malpapailug, learned from the Marshallese and Bikini. I don't know, but he was a master navigator, and he wanted to propagate this, and was visited by a number of writers. So the Polynesian Voyaging Society invited Mal to be the first navigator on a Hokulea run from Hawaii to Tahiti, and very rapidly a Hawaiian named Nainoa Thompson came under the tutelage of Mal, and Mal's system is kind of idiosyncratic, not so easy to learn. So NOAA teamed up with an astronomer at the University of Hawaii, Will Kisilka, and spent a lot of time in the planetarium there. And NOAA kind of developed his own schema. And I'd like to say it's a bit of a mixture of a Western navigation schema, but non-instrumented. And I know it was quite successful. And so what he's been doing is teaching this to other members of the Polynesian Voyaging Society. So the difference is that it's kind of a hybrid Western, / what they learned from Mao system, whereas in the Marshall Islands, at least we have this kind of unbroken continuity, which also includes stars. For example, the names of stars are actually directions for sailing in some cases. So it's a substantial difference if you're comparing one to the other.
Maybe just add just a little bit to the first part of your question is that there seems to be like really wide consensus that the navigational traditions that kind of span the breadth of the Pacific all share some really common features. So regardless of what atoll or island community you're from, there would be fairly common ways that you would, for example, set an orientation to start sailing and how you might take a backsiding to keep your course going once you start to get outside of land. Dead reckoning procedures are a little bit more complicated, but once you kind of hone in on an island, there seems to be some fairly common things, whether it's looking at birds that are going to be nesting at land at the night or certain cloud formations, the wave patterns. So there's kind of a commonality, but it seems that historically and over time, certain island groups, communities, voyaging communities developed particular techniques that were fairly, became more elaborated and developed in those particular places. So whereas if you asked almost any Pacific navigator today, even in the historical past, they would all say, yes, we know about wave reflections. We use those all the time. I think the difference is that in the Marshall Islands, it became very much elaborated so that that was kind of the center of the entire system. I think that's the difference.
Thanks. Any of you know how to navigate our health insurance system? So you don't have to answer. You're from a different country. I am very interested in this question of these two different kinds of knowledge. One I would characterize as more experiential and intuitive, and the other more abstract and analytical. Call it, and I don't know that we need to say one is science and the other isn't. It may be different kinds of knowledge. And I liked what you said about, Mr. Kelen, about these parallel, keeping them both going, not trying to make one, if I understood you, not necessarily wanting to make one the other, but have them maybe parallel. So I'd be interested in any of you might like to talk a little bit about the ways in which these forms of knowledge are different and what meaning, if any, you give to any of that.
You want the question again? You want me to rephrase it for you? Okay, so let me see if I can rephrase it and you can nod. I mean, we actually discussed this afternoon to some extent, so I'll try to reframe our discussion this afternoon. It was that, how did you know there was a current? And he said, well, I can feel it. And how did you know this? And one of the things that Alson said was that in his mind, he was sort of able to sort of calculate, I have to worry about the current, I have to worry about the wind, I know the wind's strong, I think I'm going to be here. There was a moment where he was about 15 miles off the southeast corner of Auer, and Joe radioed him because that's how we stayed in contact. And he said to Alson, where do you think you are? I said, I think I'm like 10, 15 miles off the southeast corner of Auer. This is 2:30 in the morning. And from the GPS, that was exactly where he was. And so, and so I asked Alson, well, do you use numbers? I'm moving at so many knots and it's been so many hours. And no, it was just his feeling. And then we had this discussion about how do we teach this? Do we bring in science, to it, and do we teach the Marshallese, the science? And Joe said, no, you want to be really careful because you don't want to infect people with, these Western notions. And so we really went back and forth with it. And I don't know if you want to say anything on this point, or I did have a thought about it.
again, I would say that, you know, mostly the feeling and the image that it was in my mind. You know, I kind of picture where I was going. And it's so funny because the question you're asking is the same question that we could ask a master navigator in the Marshallese. They would say the same thing. You know, we were feeling our way with the currents coming, the swells. And we always joke around, say that, you know, that's why a lot of Marshallese have big stomach, because we navigate with our stomach.
It's a kind of terrain, among other things, it's as if it's a kind of terrain, a sensory terrain.
Yeah.
So a lot of times in this realm of navigation, we'll talk about certain marks or certain signs that would indicate the direction and distance toward land. And most of those in the Marshall Islands are described as sea marks. So it's the idea that a particular wave 20 miles off land or a certain current 15 miles this way could be a mark to indicate the direction and distance. So yeah, you're exactly right. It's kind of like this spatial field of this multitude of waves coming from every possible direction, and somehow the navigator has to filter all that out, figure out what are the strong signals to figure out that land is that way. Yeah, so it is very much an embodied kind of experience that at a practical level navigators are probably drawing from.
I can add to that although we use computer models, I realize that our knowledge is still incomplete, because all the stories about feeling the reflected waves, just what was told before, we try to reconstruct it with our models, but we are still not there. All the computer models are simplifications, and I expect that we can still learn a lot from what the navigators knew. So that is one of the challenges of really unraveling what do they feel.
And just to kind of tie this in, sorry, this wasn't a question, but to tie this into the bigger thing that we're doing, to what I said in the beginning was just mentioning that Captain Corinth Joel, who kind of started this project, I mean, his whole goal was to try to get the scientific understanding, and part of it was to validate the knowledge that he already knew, to kind of increase the prestige of him and his knowledge, but the other part was to kind of flesh out the ideas. And so one quick example is, there's an image up here of a wave pattern called Nidin-Kut, and it's this kind of refracted wave pattern on the leeward side of an atoll. And when you think conceptually about what that is, it's almost identical to what the navigators talk about. I mean, it's almost match for match. Okay, we got refracted swells coming in. But then we have other things like the rilip, like John was talking about, that from a first glance make no sense oceanographically. And that's what we're trying to figure out. So it's kind of this duality of both validating and trying to add some explanations.
And I just want to add one more thing. But so I teach a course here, and one of the things that I want the students to do is to be able to find directions from the stars in the sky. And so what's interesting is like a technique that I taught myself, but they have to memorize the coordinates of the stars, the declination, and what is effectively the longitude of the star, if you like. And so it's very, they find it tedious, and it's like, why do we have to take this quiz, and they have to write down the numbers, and they have a little graph paper, and they have to plot the stars and all this other stuff. But then they have a quiz on the roof of the Science Center, and it's really something of an epiphany, because what happens is all those numbers and stuff just fall out, and you're looking at the stars, and you say, oh, you know, that's Regulus, that's Altair, that's Vega, and it just, all of a sudden, all those numbers and all that stuff falls away, and it's intuitive. It's like if I showed you a map of North America, and I tilted it sideways, and I say, which way's up? You say, oh, yeah, that way's up. And I say, how do you know? Well, because I've seen it a million times. It's the same way that, once you learn the stars, you look up and say, oh yeah, I know, what the directions are and that sort of thing. So you can take this kind of scientific approach to learning something, and then it develops into intuition. And I think it's just one path that you could take. It's not necessarily exclusive, but I think it could also speed up, having to go out on the water over and over again. It could seed, learning in some way.
Continuing the stars a bit, is there any evidence that they use the sun or the stars to add to their wave knowledge?
Well, I think as a supplement, I don't know. You want to talk?
Yeah. The stars, we use the stars, but not as much. Mostly we use the swells.
Captain Corn, he told us one time that the stars are not as reliable as the swells because the stars are always moving around. That's a Marshallese conception.
But here's one thing. Here's one thing though. At sunset, Alson did use the sunset as a way of establishing the directionality of the swells, and thus assumed that the swells were then coming from the same direction throughout the night. So
you use it as a calibration then from time to time.
yeah.
I was curious about how the boat design was affected or interacted with the actual idea of navigation and the type of navigation. And just also as a sort of a aside, the traditional boats, where did they get the materials to build those large boats? I mean, my understanding of atolls is they don't have a lot of timber.
Yes. Well, the boat that we used actually was built with fiberglass because it's a learning vessel for the young people, for the youth. So, and it was funded by grants, so we had to, it was part of the deal. But in the olden days, we built our boats with breadfruit trees. And Marshallese boats are actually planks sewn together. And every once in a while, we would, a drift log would come in. But in the olden days, drift log is like gold. So if you find a drift log, it belongs to the chief because that would be the next voyaging canoe for the chief. So yes, the canoes were, like I said, the canoes were sewn together. So on a voyage, there's a bailer. And if the bailer would reach land a few times, then they give him a piece of land. That's an award. Because those canoes in those days, if the water come to your belly button, they said, well, that's a really dry canoe.
Actually got him.
Thanks for a great presentation. And I'm curious, have you considered adding a psychologist or a cognitive psychologist to your team? I was struck by that thought, thinking about what you were saying about feeling things. And people have a sense of time that a psychologist still don't understand. It can be dark, and some people are very good at knowing what time it is with no cues, and other people are not. And I don't think that that's very well understood, but I'm guessing that this kind of navigating by feeling is related to that. And so have you guys thought about that?
I've certainly consulted with a large number of cognitive psychologists.
Do they have ideas?
So, yeah, I mean, it certainly would help. I mean, I read a lot of it because it helps inform it. So I'm thinking the same thing. I haven't found anybody that's really ready to jump in with both feet. So if you know somebody, send them our way.
Well, I talk about psychologists. I was involved, and I was part of a crew that sailed Makali from Hawaii through Micronesia. That was Mark Pialo's last voyage. But I was telling these guys that every 5 to 30 minutes, somebody had to wash the dishes. So we keep washing and washing the dishes, I think, just to get our mind from the open ocean that you see out there. So that's when you talk about psychology, that was the first thing that came to my mind.
To pick up on that, in the martial arts tradition, the center of balance is about 3 inches or 3 thumb lengths below your belly button. It's called the tanden and ohara. And in martial arts, you move from there. That's your center of gravity. That's also the second chakra in the Indian yoga system. So I'm wondering whether your stomach, the feelings in your stomach, relate to that kind of idea of the tanden and the chakra.
First I've heard of it, but it's good to know.
I would just, I don't know. I don't know if we know the answer to that one right now. But what John and I kind of picked up on going through some of the academic literature recently was this notion of proprioception, which is what we've come to learn is like, it's a little bit like kinesthetic motion, and kinesthetic intelligence is like when your body is actually moving through something. And vestibular would be like if your body's kind of swaying on a canoe, but nobody's really like running on a canoe. So it's really like proprioception is kind of like these small, tiny movements that somehow impact your sense of where you are. And so for the most part, like if Alson is sitting on the canoe, he's just sitting there. He's just sitting there on the leeward platform of a canoe, just rocking back and forth with the motion of the canoe. And so probably it's the tiny little, feelings of his leg pushing up against the creaking wood, and that's giving him a sense of what's happening on the ocean. And probably this term proprioception is as close as we can come to kind of really getting at what is probably happening inside the body. But
What was
it's a great
it was
question.
the second chakra? I'll look that up.
I had a question for Alson. That journey that you made between the islands, have you done that many times?
That was my second time.
Okay. So you had a sense when you were moving of the angle of the waves to the boat, and you knew when the angle of the waves was going to change. Just the way a hill might bend if someone was walking along the top of a mountain range or something like that. And you had a sense of the time that the boat was traveling and when that angle was supposed to happen, and you knew exactly where you were relative to an island. Is it just like you have a map in your brain and you just...
I wish, but something like that. No, just kidding. Yeah, I think from the first voyage I went on, I know the length. I mean, the time it would take us to sail from Majuro.
You knew the boat, you knew the wind, you knew the waves, you knew the current.
Yeah, and when I was going out, I think my big concern was make sure I don't hit the island. And with all the winds and the swells come in, I want to go as far east as possible. So this way I can just, follow the wind and come onto the island.
Was there any point where you had some question, or were you always like, no, I think I'm right here?
Just tell a rainbow story.
Huh?
The rainbow, can I tell it for you?
Okay.
Okay, I have to tell it for him, he doesn't like to brag, but, so there was this thing about the 2:30 in the morning where he nailed exactly where he was, and we ended up sailing a little bit too far to the east, so when the sun rose, you couldn't see anything, didn't know the island, but he was sure that our was to the east of it. And so when we started to get the tow, his crew was like, how do you know? And he said, we're heading towards that rainbow. There was a rainbow because there was a storm. And so, no, we're heading right towards our. And sure enough, like just a little while after that, it started to pop out. The other one, which I'll also say, just to give you some cred, was on the way back. It was slower because the wind kind of dropped out and there was this concern about the current. So he wanted to get some sleep. Now this is where, unfortunately, the watch comes into it, but what the hell. So he was sleeping, he said, okay, wake me up, to the crew, wake me up, we're gonna find Majuro. We're gonna see Majuro somewhere between 9:30 and 10. And so they let him sleep a little bit too long. It was 9:50 and he gets up and he says, hey, we should see Majuro, right? And then one of the crew looks up and says, oh yeah, there it is. And so it was exactly the time that they found landfall. So, whatever he's doing, it works.
I think Alson is evading your question with a humbleness that is distinctly Marshallese right now. Yes.
So I have to talk for him.
I keep saying kachiriri, which means guessing.
Good guessing.
So I'm curious about a few of the choices that y'all made, because I'm not from New England, so these are questions that I don't have from the inherent knowledge that many people here have about sailing. And so, y'all chose to go south up to Our as opposed to, north up to Our as opposed to Jalowit, or is it Kili or Millie that's south? Or why didn't you go east-west? Or why did you go north first versus, like those questions, and you said both times you left in the evening. Was there a purpose for that, or was it personal choice? And then also about the supplies, I saw the rice and the coffee. Did the weight of that factor into your trip or not? Yeah.
What was he saying?
The rationale for going north-south. Why going in the evening?
I think the decision to go out, because we live on Majuro, so we were just we going out north to our. But the reason for going in the evening was, one of the reasons was we want to, when we get up, we see our. But the plan was we were supposed to wait a little bit on the island at the mouth of the channel, but when we went out, we enjoyed the trip too much that we just continue and go and just start going out to our. That wasn't part of the plan, but it's just because we went a little bit early. We changed the course a bit toward east.
I'll just add on that. So these canoes, they're not tacking canoes. They're actually called shunting canoes. So to change direction, you have to pick up the sail and walk it down the length of the hull and put it in. So it can be quite dangerous on the open ocean to shunt the canoe to change direction. So because the winds were coming from the east, it's basically a straight shot north, and there'd be no need to actually do that maneuver on the ocean. That was part of the strategy of going straight north. And then all that food, that was on the escort vessel. So they had like a couple bags of food, but we had like a couple 100 pounds of stuff in the bottom of our escort vessel. Yeah.
Thank you. Alison, I'm wondering if you could explain or translate the chant that you started with, and does it have any significance about the navigational process?
It's actually a chant that we do when we sail. So it's the first is actually two chants. Chine chine kwaratogiamoto ngai akanu ngai akanu. Ooh. That chant is actually it's a spirit. So when we're actually welcoming the spirit to be part of the crew. And the other chant is to speed up the canoe. Kuba kanam drapichat is the outrigger to hold on to balance the canoe. Lemenam pavaren is the bailer to bail out any problems that you face as you go out. Lodanam kallo is when before you go, the load is the top part of the sail, the mast. So you actually look forward. So you set your course and you kind of look into it. So kopanam waile is the bow of the canoe. So you point the canoe into that course that you already set. The whole sentence means that you work together and you aim, and everything will be as fast as the lightning when the lightning strike. And so it's kind of like a spiritual, chant to push the canoe faster. And that's in the olden days, everything is all spirits and chanting.
Okay, one more question.
Here's another one. Just technical. Joe said they're shunting canoes, and so I'm wondering, what do you use to steer? Is it a rudder?
We actually have two paddles, big used paddles, and one guy would steer with the big paddle. It's called Gerbrant, but there's also a smaller helper, smaller paddle to help. So Jabangri, which literally means the small helper. So these paddle actually have the rope that ties to the middle of the canoe. So they'll still be just part of they won't go anywhere. But when you shunt, then you throw them in the water. And then because when you shunt, the canoe actually move direction and the paddle will drift automatically to the other side. But when you shunt in the ocean, because you're going up and down, the sail actually, the guy would go to the front and pick up the sail. And then when the canoe go down, the sail is kind of in the air because it's so heavy. So all you do is you actually just guiding the sail, because when you go down, a couple guys in the back actually hold on to the rope because the mast go like this. So there's a rope, so they kind of pushed, and the sail actually automatically, just kind of fly over to the other side. And it's amazing because these sail, it takes about 5 or 6 guys to put it on the canoe and set it up. But when it's shunting in the middle of the ocean, it's easier to shunt in the middle of the ocean than. So, but you have to know what you're doing, otherwise it's dangerous. And it's we're talking about belly button, and again, that's how you measure the rope when you take the rope that actually secure the sail to the sail step. You bring up the rope and you put it to your belly button, and then you go down and you kind of temporarily lash. So when you bring the rope, the sail to the side, it won't go all the way out. It just stops. And whoever came up with the measure with the belly button, actually have done it many times. And
Is there somebody there? I guess this will be the last one. So.
Okay. I have a question for you. Thank you very much, by the way. This is a wonderful presentation. I guess this question is for Joe and Alson, and it's about language. So I think this presentation has done a wonderful job of helping us navigate between the cognitivist and the experiential kind of models of knowledge, and also showing kind of that those boundaries are quite blurry, in fact. And on the one hand, there's sort of the mathematics of the matter, and there's the sort of stomach feeling on the other hand. But I'm wondering about this in-between stuff to do with language and words like swell or dillip. And maybe this is a question to start with you, Joe, about how do you use language to sort of try to commensurate or not these different kinds of knowledge systems, and what are the limits of that? What are the affordances?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of language, I mean, for myself as an outsider, just the raw aspect of trying to learn Marshallese in the first place was challenging. But once I got to a certain level of fluency, I could start to inquire a little bit more about those meanings and about what they represent and all the different parts of that. I guess what's interesting about this particular domain of navigation in the Marshall Islands is that there's an extremely there's a lot of older terminology that seems to be from a long time ago, but in terms of practical language today, the number of Marshallese terms that have to do with waves and swells and currents is really, really limited. I could probably count less than 10 terms that have to do with feelings of like either roll or pitch. It's very, very limited. And so in practice, like talking with people like Captain Corin, whether it was talk story, interviewing, or being on the canoe, just being with him when he was looking at the waves, most of it was not in an articulate explanation. I mean, we tried to do that as much as possible, but really for him, it was just like, look, there it is. And there weren't descriptions to say like, well, there's a certain shape of a wave and that's what you need to be feeling and you're gonna feel this certain thing. Like, it was nothing ever like that. So it was more a very minimal amount of language to gain access, and it was more just our ability, both Alson and mine, in the beginning, this is like going back 10 years, basically trying to feel what he was pointing out and then somehow internalizing that feeling but not being able to articulate it. But then when you get into the actual terminology, there is a lot of overlap, and sometimes there might be a Marshallese word for wave, which can also mean current, and sometimes that could also refer to a swell, and so sometimes the language itself will get very convoluted, and it was very frustrating for me trying to be very like, okay, we have to know what this term means, and a lot of times it was just a very interchangeable. yeah, Alson, you want to speak to that at all?
Well, I could say that there were two words that I actually they were repeated all the time. There, you feel it? So that's it's like Joe said, it's very limited. So I had the the opportunity to say with Captain Corin in certain view voyages, and most he doesn't really talk. He just said there. You see it there. You feel it? Okay. So that was kind of like communication go back and forth, and I think it's pretty much the experience. I think that's what the focus was.
Okay, so thank you. Give the panel